Good morning. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. As you know, over the past couple of years, the provincial government in Ontario has been enacting legislation to try and restrict the purchase of residential property by non-Canadians. Called it the foreign buyer spec tax. Originally, it came out at a 15% tax level, and it impacted properties right around the Golden Horseshoe and some other areas, for example, Barrie. Then they changed the legislation, increased it to 20% tax, and incorporated the whole province of Ontario. And then as recently as last October, they bumped the tax up to 25%. Now, there were exemptions and there were provisions to get the tax back, but you had to pay it up front, and it was a lot of money in addition to the purchase price of the property. And the intent was to try and cool down the real estate market. Now, as of January 1, the federal government has stepped in and they've introduced legislation, something they called the Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act. And what they've done, instead of having a tax, they've just unilaterally said across the country, it's now illegal for a non-Canadian to buy certain residential properties. And we want to take a look at that. First of all, what do we mean by certain residential properties? Well, we mean a typical dwelling, a single-family home. It can be almost any form. It can be a semi-detached, it can be a townhouse, condominium, it can be a bungalow, up to triplex. Anything over a triplex isn't impacted by this prohibition. And it deals with also non-recreational property. So you can still buy a cottage if you're a non-resident. You just can't buy a permanent dwelling. And there are certain low-density areas across the country that are not impacted. Basically, if nobody wants the property, then a foreign buyer can buy the property. And they're vague as terms of what these areas are. And so if I can find out later, I'll let you know later. That's a type of property. Who's impacted? First of all, foreign nationals are impacted, but also foreign corporations, and also Canadian corporations that are controlled by foreign entities, and also Canadian corporations that have foreign ownership of greater than 3% are all impacted and come under this legislation. Now, as is the case with the provincial legislation, there are exemptions. And some of these exemptions are a little bit unclear. Canadian citizens, obviously, are exempt from the prohibition. Permanent residents are exempt from the prohibition. International students under certain criteria, and it's fairly strict criteria. They've got to be here in the country for a certain amount of time, file income tax returns, etc., etc. Temporary residents, in other words, they're here on a work permit and they've got a full-time job, again, with restrictions, they can buy a property if they meet the criteria of the limitations. Refugees, somebody who's coming into the country under the Refugee Act, they are exempt from this ban on purchasing. An Indian under the Indian Act is exempt from the ban. Also, spouses of a Canadian citizen or spouses from an exempt person is exempt, and they can purchase property. The next one is interesting, and I'm not sure, I can't get any clarification on this, but they say transitional events are also exempt. And what do they mean by a transitional event? They mean a death where you inherit the property from somebody. They mean a divorce where you're picking up the property and the spouse no longer is. And they mean a gift. Now, there's got to be some restrictions, or you can see a wide open door to circumvent the policy by certainly gifts and divorce and so on. But that's where it stands right now. Also, somebody who is under a diplomatic passport is exempt, and they can buy the land. And the last one, in the provincial, they had what was called a nominee. And a nominee was somebody who the Canadian or the provincial government wanted into the province. Somebody who had the right skill set, the right job experience, the right education, and it was a good fit to bring them in because there was a need and jobs. Somebody, for example, as a doctor coming in from overseas, can they? And this is so far has been silent on nominees. I don't know whether or not there's any provision They gave me a phone number I could call. I called the government to get clarification. I got a recording saying the person's not available. You weren't even allowed to leave a message. So I haven't got the clarification on that. But I would think that somewhere along the line, nominees should be included. Here's the thing I want you to get to. There are strict penalties involved for breaching this act. If you've gone ahead and purchased a property when you're not allowed to purchase the property, there's provisions to issue an order requiring the sale of that property. But here's the other thing. If it's deemed that you as an individual have assisted or attempted to assist somebody in acquiring property illegally, then you're going to be charged under the criminal code and you can be fined up to $10,000. Well, that puts a target right in the chest of realtors because we're going to be involved in a purchase in most cases. So the Canadian Real Estate Association has developed a form, and they call it the Certificate of Consent of Purchase. Certificate of Consent of Purchase. And I've embedded this in the video that you're watching so you can download it. It's a very simple one-page form, and there's another page on instructions. I'll put both there, and you can read them. And what it does is it takes the monkey off your back and puts it on the back of the buyer. You're asking the buyer, are you exempt? Are you a Canadian citizen? They fill that out. You've done your homework. You're not trying to assist them to illegally buy the property, and you're asking these kind of questions and documenting it. So I would suggest that it's a good idea to use that form, especially if there's any question at all whether the person qualifies or doesn't qualify under this restrictions in the Act. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video. I'll talk to you again next week.